Fantastic. All right. Welcome, everyone. It's really fantastic. The 25th is a very tricky day in South Africa because it's payday. So most people are not are not sitting at home or in their offices. Right now, they're out there in the shop. So it's really great to see everyone. We're really honored at Gauteng Anthropology to have Dr. Merrian Brooks. Who's going to be presenting on identity as a tool for liberation. And as I was saying to her just before we started, that we're not going to do the whole elaborate introduction thing, because I think it's wonderful when people can really introduce themselves. So without really wasting any more time, I will hand over to you, Dr. Brooks. And I'm just going to kindly ask if people can keep themselves muted, and then we can have a conversation at the end. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, so you'll just have to keep an eye on the chat box and all that other stuff for me, because for whatever reason, I can only see my slides.
So no worries, I'll do that.
All right. So I'm Merrian Brooks. I'm a physician, a pediatrician, and an adolescent medicine and young adult specialist. Essentially, that just makes me a developmentalist. So I think about people and their health within the frame, within the framework of their development over time. And I'm particularly interested in the development of identity over time, as it's one of the most important things that happens during adolescence. And in fact, it is considered the seminal developmental milestone of adolescence and young adulthood, because it is so central to our sense of selves as human beings. So I'm really interested in it, and having been now living in Botswana for the last almost 4 years, and also having spent a good amount of time speaking with young people in Ghana and a few other countries, I've been thinking a lot about, what does it mean to have an identity that is something that's authentic and solid, and how do I think that we can think about identity as individuals and as a collective, and how can it help to liberate us from some really difficult, deep issues. So I'm going to talk first about the background, sort of the things that go into the setting up the scaffolding for the formation of identity, and then we're going to have a talk. We're going to talk amongst ourselves about some key thought processes, and I'm going to confront you with some ideas, and I'd love to hear how those ideas strike you. And I'm also going to be taking note of your feedback on each of the ideas, so that we can further use this as a catalyst for all of you to continue to think about identity and your scholarly contribution to identity. So I'll start with the wonderful Steve Biko. It becomes more necessary to see the truth as it is if you realize that the only vehicle for change are these people who have lost their personality. And I would say that he's really talking about identity here. The first step, therefore, is to make the Black man come to himself, to pump back life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity. And I want you to think about this quote, because it's really the center of what we're talking about here. And the reason why identity formation is so important to Black people in general, and I think post-colonial people, post-colonial Black people specifically, and of course there are post-colonial non-Black people, but I think that the ways in which the world sort of descends upon Blackness is important to think specifically about Blackness and the way that our identities kind of become hijacked, even as we are in 2021. So I want you guys first to think about 4 or 5 terms that you would use to describe yourself as you remember it during, say, junior secondary school, and then think of it again as secondary school, and then just think about some terms. And then I'm going to just give you a minute to think about it. And if anybody wants to jump out or in the chat box, just say what are some terms that come to mind from junior secondary school and then secondary school. And if they're different, just kind of throw it out there. You can just unmute yourself and say it, or you can put it in the chat box.
Sure. There also is a function to just raise your hand so that I can see whoever wants to speak. So you can also just raise your hand if you want to vocalize your response.
Right.
Okay, I've noted your hand, Shandu. Let's give others just maybe 30 to 1 more minute to think about it. All right. Whilst others are still thinking, I think you can go, Shandu, and share your thoughts.
Shandu, were you sharing out loud? If so, you might be muted.
Yes, I think you have to first unmute yourself, Shandu. We still can't hear you. I see your mic is going on and off. Okay.
There we go.
Oh, is it better now?
Yes.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. That's fixed. So the first term I can use to describe myself as an adolescent, I can say I was a bit cantankerous.
Mm-hmm.
I was tense. I was also driven.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the last one would be I was unhappy. Sorry, is this too revealing?
No, B is revealing. I hope it goes without saying. This is safe space zone. You know, I think we're going to have some interesting conversations here. So please, you can reveal as much as or as little as you like.
I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. TK, I see your hand. You can go.
I can't think of 5. Hi, everyone. I can't think of 5 terms, but I think I can think of 3. I was naive. I was hopeful. I was asleep, I guess being the opposite of woke. I was I was optimistic about life, I guess. And I was also, I didn't know it back then, but I was also like Shandu, unhappy.
Yeah. So what I love about each of those terms for both of you is that they're really perfect examples of a stage in adolescence where when you tell the story about yourself, you use certain kinds of characteristics. And so one of the things that, you know, we're going to think about here centrally is sort of like, how do we see ourselves when it comes to racial and ethnic identity? But when you're young, especially, you know, and especially considering the space, right? Like, we often describe ourselves with respect to thoughts, feelings, you know, sort of human essentials, right? And what's really important about that is that, you know, for some reason, or not for some reason, for very calculated reasons related to white supremacy, we lose a lot of those sort of like feelings, thoughts, human-based descriptions of ourselves, and we sort of move towards these broader categories. And so I just want to kind of get you guys to just think, what do each of those things mean? And what I mean by that is, how did you come to that definition? And how did you come to a space where that felt like it was you and not just a moment in time? And I also want you to think about what contributed to the changes between, say, junior secondary school to secondary school, or the changes between junior secondary school, and you today. And what do you think might have contributed to those changes? So if anybody has any thoughts that they can share just related to what you think contributed to those changes.
Okay, I see your hand, Shandu, but I don't know if Michael, that was a mistake, but Michael was first, but you sort of lowered the hand quite quickly. But let's go to Shandu, and then Michael, after Shandu, if you want to contribute, you can share.
So I think for me, what I can say, it was structural. It was my background, where I grew up, because obviously in South Africa, we have the migrant labor system. So I was separated from my parents at the time. So I was raised by my grandparents, and that kind of contributed to a lot of tension. There was a lot of tension in my household because as grandparents were raising quite a number of teenagers in the house. That was very difficult for them, teenage with angst, teenagers who wanted to be with their own parents and who had their own ideas, were driven in their own ways, wanted to be sports. And I was obviously queer, and I was kind of straddling along and navigating a number of identities at the time. And the difference now is that I do have some liberation in terms of just knowing who I am and my place in the world. I have quite a great sense of that now than I was then.
Exactly. That's really, really helpful. And I just want to highlight how much the environment played a role in sort of constricting your experience. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, the power just tripped. So hopefully that won't change anything. All right. So so I just want you guys to sort of keep that example or your own examples in mind as we go through this, of sort of what contributed to your sense of self at that time, because, you know, like I said, your identity formation is key to liberating you for the first time. And that example that we just got is actually perfect of how, as you grow, if you can have this process, which not everybody does, of identity formation, it really gives you the opportunity to get some liberation. So I just want to briefly talk about why identity matters, sort of beyond just the fact of the matter that it's important to how we see ourselves and how we move through the world. I also want you to think about it in terms of other elements of who we are. So one is your psychological outcomes are tied to this identity formation, to this sense of self-exploration. And we're going to talk about that more as we go along. But your psychological outcomes, when you have a strong sense of identity, tend to be better than if you are in other various stages of your psychological exploration, or of your identity exploration. The other is that your social interactions and encounters are also tied to your sense of self-exploration. So whether you consider yourself as authentic and whether you feel like you can move freely in the world is directly related to that self-exploration. Your health overall, there are tons of health outcomes that are actually associated with your identity and self-exploration. And even academic outcomes. There's a lot of literature that's tied to young people's academic performance as they're going through this process of self-exploration. And as they become more firm in their sense of self, they're more likely to perform better, even in not great circumstances. So I'm just going to talk a little bit for the developmentalists in the house about how the development actually contributes to how we see ourselves over time. So in infancy, we have very, I don't want to say crude because that sounds like pejorative, but we have a fundamental assessment of who we are is based on our relative perception, so how we relate to people next to us and close to us, and based mostly on our motor functions. There's a lot about who we are that's tied to imitation, and there's no good framework for memories or experiences, or anything that would be easily accessible for the future. You do have implicit memories though. So before the age of 2 or 3, most of your memories are related to sort of an essence of a memory, but you don't have clear memories. But implicit memories, we see how strong they are because by early childhood, we find that there are some senses of self. So the idea that a young child can be confident or have self-esteem or be very clear on how they are with respect to how they're spoken to shows that implicit memories do play some kind of a role in our sense of self, because we go from sort of shifting from not really having any framework for memories to having things like confidence and self-recognition and self-esteem. By middle childhood, we can talk about ourselves in physical and psychological terms. So now we can talk about ourselves, as we mentioned in the beginning, related to feelings and ideas, and also who we are, what we look like, whether we're in the right body. All of those things are usually coming out by middle childhood. And we also start having a hierarchical sense of ourselves. So what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? And we also talk about generally middle childhood. Things are so concrete that strengths and weaknesses are easily put into context, interestingly, and then self-esteem is generally high. Lots of comparison starts to happen at this age, where young people start looking at their peers and seeing how they are, kind of unexamined, really, comparing themselves to their peers. And by early adolescence, the abstractions start coming along. So we start thinking about ourselves as within the imaginary audience. Usually this is when self-esteem is going to drop, and abstract values like kind or loving or thoughtful might be part of the vocabulary that somebody uses for themselves. And then the social comparisons that started in middle childhood continue. So I just want to take a moment to note that those processes, those developmental milestones in terms of autobiographical self, so how we see ourselves, do actually change in the literature when it comes to Black youth. And most of this, of course, is from the US, just because there's so much prolific publishing in the US. And so the first time we kind of break off from this idea that there's sort of one way of developing for all youth everywhere is when we start looking at the literature for Black youth. And what we see here is that infancy is pretty much the same, but in early childhood, that overconfidence and that high self-esteem actually gets replaced with lower confidence and internalization. And so if you've ever seen the doll study where the 3- and 4-year-olds are asked about which doll is the good doll, which child is the good child, and how they associate whiteness with goodness, and Black children associate whiteness with goodness and Blackness with badness, then we see that this is actually the time when that comes out. So what does that mean? That means that implicit memories from infancy, actually, so from infancy and toddlerhood, are actually infiltrating young children's minds, and they start internalizing at a very young age. And I just want you to keep that in mind, because internalization is a huge part of what we have to think about when we get to the point where we're going through the stages of self-development. During middle childhood, some changes also occur. So instead of it being high self-esteem with general peer comparison, it becomes very self-esteem, usually lower depending on how woke or asleep they are. And often the comparisons are now with the dominant group. Dominant being whatever that means to the child. And then in early adolescence, that social comparisons are sort of related now to an awareness of stereotypes. And what that means is that in early adolescence, we might actually see that the self-esteem, it may still continue to vary, but the self-esteem may start working its way up, because now there's context for those implicit internalizations. And now we can say, okay, the reason why people do this, treat me this way, or whatever, is because of their bias and stereotypes. So it's their problem and not mine. So generally, the point being that we are going through, from birth, really, we're going through a very complex essence of ourselves. And that search for self, which is really defined as a major drama that unfolds on center stage during adolescence. And it's a complicated cast of characters who do not always speak with a single voice. So like I mentioned, we are going through this whole process of trying to figure out both internally and externally. And our examples in the beginning showed that, we have external influences from our family, from where we are, both geographic and also at a point in time. And we think about all of that stuff comes crashing together during adolescence. And that's why sometimes it is contradictory, which is totally normal. So just to highlight this, I just want to show that really the autobiographical self, when it's spoken about in psychology and development, it's really about how do I describe myself. And so our examples in the beginning were perfect. Sort of, a small child might say, I'm short, or I'm like mommy, or what have you. And in early childhood, they might describe themselves, again, physically. I have pretty hair, I have dark skin. And then when they get older, they might say, I'm fun, I'm funny. And as they get, into their adolescence, they might say, I'm thoughtful, I'm an activist, I am a, meaningful contributor to humanity in a number of ways, etc. So I want you to remember that this context, as much as, a lot of Western discourse talks about context of the mind as separate from all of these other things, I think it's important to really highlight that there's a lot going on in the human as the self is being developed, as the self identity is being developed, and that includes physical development, right? So how we're changing, how our bodies are changing, cognitive development. So, you know, as I was saying, our autobiographical self changes actually directly related to our brain changes. And so we talk about ourselves as our brains continue to develop in a variety of different ways. Our social development, our integration with our communities or disintegration with our communities, identity development and moral development. So they all contribute to ourself, and they're all happening often. I mean, they're all constantly happening, but during the time of adolescence, there is the most rapid changes and most profound. So in late adolescence is really when we start talking about these big shifts in identity, and that complex understanding of ourselves is often going to come with a variety of different descriptions and contradictions. And in that process, there are a number of different stages that have been described: identity diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. I'm going to talk about those more in a little bit, but I just want you to think of late adolescence as really that time to get woke. So I'm briefly going to talk about some of those other things that go into identity. So one is pubertal development, and none of this happened, you know, with Black people. None of this is allowed to happen without being informed by white supremacy, unfortunately. Pubertal development is one of the first things, right? So when young people are asking the question, am I normal? And seeing so much of the cultural supremacy that exists in the media, it can be a lot goes into those physical developments. So not only do Black people have to physically develop in the context of the changes of the storm of adolescence, they also have to do this within the context of cultural supremacy. And also just, this is also the time when sexual identity and development becomes clear. Although it's often clear long before this, it's when we start getting physical changes that strengthen some of those bonds. And so again, Black people have to also deal with the context of the way that these different forces also speak not only about their bodies, but also how they see themselves sexually and as sexual beings. And that's actually across the sexuality spectrum. Cognitively, there's a shift from concrete to formal operations, so more abstract thinking and hypothetical analysis. And that's why it's so important to give young people really strong context so they can really have good use of this cognitive development. There's a lot of talk about egocentrism, and it's true that there's a lot of egocentrism, but it's really more about coming out as an individual. And that's really, you know, like egocentrism much, because I think egocentrism is often framed as this negative thing. But really, if we didn't have egocentrism, we would all just never leave our parents if they're good parents, or families if they're good families, right? We would always kind of stick to the collective and never go out on our own because we don't see ourselves beyond our immediate families. So I think it's important to think about egocentrism as a necessary step to move out so that we can move back in. And then there's these other notions of magical thinking, imaginary audience, myth of immunity, and personal fable. And all of them together essentially say, I'm special, I am the center, and I can I can rationalize to myself that things will be a certain way, or that they'll turn out a certain way. And actually, I think that this is really important, a really important milestone for adolescents, because otherwise we would all crumble during adolescence, right? If we didn't have some sense of magical thinking or feeling like we're immune or whatever, why would we ever leave? So we need egocentrism. We need some of this myth of immunity so that we don't walk into the world in fear. And I think that that's really important to remember. And then social development is really about the increased desire for independence, preferences for spending time with peers. Although people tend to be more attached to their family members, the peers take a vital role. And like I said, that individuation happens and is necessary. And then the way that a young person goes socially has a lot to do with cultural and overall context. And then this last point I just want to make, because I think it's important to remember, if you only remember one part of this, is that the brain does not fully mature until the early 20s. And that's why young people, adolescents, and people in their early 20s are much more loving, much more emotional, much more thoughtful, and much more able to change the world than older people, because those brain changes are directly attached to the emotionally sensitive regions being very big and mostly in charge. And they're growing to be connected to planning and decision making, but the emotion kind of rules the day. Now, sometimes that ends up being, difficult for us to manage, but mostly it's a stage of life where I always tell young people, like, please enjoy the time where you love more than you're ever going to love probably in the rest of your life, because it is a way, it's an emotional experience that is really unmatched to any other part of life. And then the neuroendocrine changes, again, just like the physical changes, there's no Black child really on the planet that can sort of go through these changes without having them be informed. So we have the hormonal things that happen to everyone, but when you're in a police state like us, and you're in a situation where the culture wants to contain adolescents and young people, then these energizers, pleasure producers, mood stabilizers, confidence makers, they're actually anti the community sometimes and anti the state. And so the point I want to make about each of these changes is that they're not they happen and they're informative, and they don't exist in any kind of a vacuum. And we can see how difficult it can be to come to yourself when you have all of these qualities that may be counter to dominant messaging. I just want to take a brief moment to think about moral reasoning as well. So moral reasoning also happens during this time. And again, just like everything else, nothing happens in a vacuum. And so we go through these stages of sort of being obedient, for some of us shorter times than others, but to a self-orientation, to interpersonal conformity, authority, social contract, and then universal principles. Now, Malcolm X has that quote about not judging people for being, not where you are, essentially. And I think that this is important to remember, because as we think about the identity formation and getting to the place where we are sort of what everybody thinks of as, woke or principled, it takes actually a lot of steps to get there. And people are taking those steps within the context of cultural supremacy, within the context of, police states and other cultural elements that want to constrain and oppress. And so, people are going to win when they're into law and order morality, right? And so if you are struggling in many places of your life, but your moral reasoning is at the law and order morality, then at least there you don't have to worry about any hardships, right? And so people might get stagnant on a particular developmental part in the chain, because it usually goes this way, top to bottom. And some people might be protecting themselves by being in a law and order morality, particularly after they've grown up being Black. So I just want you to think, how did these changes in your life make you who you are? So how did your pubertal development or sexual development or your increase in sexual desire or your sense of power, emotionality, how did they make you who you are? And also a corollary to that, how do you think egocentrism and other normally inwardly directed cognitive stages play out in a collective-centered cultural framework? So just think for a minute and tell me what you think about how these changes made you and how you think these changes might fit into a collectivist-centered frame.
Feel free to just raise your hand, and then I'll just signal whoever is ready to speak. Okay, fantastic. Tulani, please feel free to go ahead.
Well, okay, can you hear me? I hope.
Yep.
Relating to egocentrism, like I'm thinking from childhood, I've been an assertive person, and that has almost made me to be framed as being arrogant or disrespectful. So how does this play out in cultural context? It's like I've been otherfied or being classified as the other by the effect of me being self-assertive. So I'm thinking that's how egocentrism played out in cultural frame context.
Yeah, and and I think it's also why certain groups, I mean, right, culture can be at the level of the family, right? And I think that's why some families, for example, might be more, into, people being self-assertive, and other families might feel like it's wholly disrespectful to be self-assertive. And so now your entire adolescence, through which you are having this process of egocentrism that's normal and needed for you to leave the nest. So now you're constantly in conflict during your adolescence, which is a difficult thing to be in when you are trying to find yourself from a cultural framework, right? Like, because who we are as ethnically and racially depends on those relationships with those people who might be pushing us away because of our normal developmental stages. So that's a great example. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Matome, please feel free to go ahead. And then there's a comment. I'll read it after Matome's comment. Matome,
Sure.
unmute yourself.
All right. Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Okay. Right. Thank you. Just to give a little bit of context, and I think this is about mid-adolescence, using my own lived experience. So there was a couple of changes. So now you're having those changes of trying to find yourself. You don't have an actual male figure in the family or so it's just you and just females in the family. And while you're still trying to figure yourself out and having all those changes, then happens the issue of now having to move to a completely different cultural environment. And what I mean by this is that I was in an environment where, I guess cultural and religious, I was in an environment where it was religious, and that comes with, its attached norms and whatnot. And then when I moved to a different environment, which was a lot more rural, it was a lot more cultural, or a lot more spiritual, in that there weren't even any churches around the area. So now it's the issue of now, how do I then now, because I find myself, but there are all these changes, first of which is the thing of not having a male figure attached, so you don't really have that male perspective. The second thing is that now you are switching between, sort of like environments where now you're no longer being informed by a culture, but you're now also being informed by, you're not longer being informed by religion, but now you're also being informed by culture. So it's that issue of now, how do you then form an identity where you now have three different perspectives or three different influences on you trying to figure yourself out while you're going through those hormonal changes during adolescence.
That's great, and I'm just taking some notes here based on your story. So I just want to make a quick comment to that, and I think it's something for all of us to think about, because many of us have been in similar scenarios, and that is that it's already difficult to be an adolescent and to be going through all of these changes at once. And each of those moves, right, either frame shifts by switching from one religious context to another, to actual geographical shifts, they all can potentially stagnate your process. So you kind of get stuck or even more confused, but it can also be a crisis that actually helps you to stimulate your process in self-development. I'm just writing those notes.
Okay, whilst you are writing that, Dr. Brooks, there's a comment in the chat, and it's from KG, who's asking, first of all, apologizing for being late, but asking, but how did Dr. Brooks' finding differ from the Western ways of thinking when it comes to the usually psychologized states of development? And he's quite specific that he's asking in relation to Black girls. So I don't know if you want to respond to this now or save it for the Q&A later.
I think it's a more general question to the overall idea, right? Like the idea of sort of thinking about this and whether it's useful or not, and whether it's overly one way or the other. But I think I'll save that one for the end.
Sure, thank you. You can continue whenever you're ready.
Okay. So I'm going to specifically talk about the identity development portion now. And again, it's all about just framing the processes. And I want to talk about identity and how some specifically Black American scholars have thought about it in more recent times. And so essentially most literature, thought processes, and even sort of observed instances of identity formation are tied up in this idea of who am I uniquely, right? So having a firm sense of identity versus having role confusion. And youth explore beliefs within this idea of crisis and commitment. So in our last example, we talked about moving a lot, so religion, like different family contexts and geographic contexts. Often those things are going to lead from crisis to commitment. And then most of these values are going to also be reflected and integrated with the influences of our families, of our generations, and of our cultures. And that's usually going to happen by the 20s. And I know lots of people who will say that they didn't have any sort of real sense of who they were, or they couldn't articulate it, or they couldn't tell that story, right? Which is the frame in which I'm coming from, right? Being able to tell that autobiographical story, and for that story to inform the way we act in the world. And that usually is not going to happen until the 20s. So ethnic identity specifically, and I'm going to use ethnic and racial identities sort of interchangeably, even though they're not the same, right? So the definitions that are used around racial identity are sort of, what is your connection to Blackness? And ethnic identity is what is your, often simplified, like what is your identity with culture and with cultures, right? Because we all have multiple cultures that we're a part of. And in fact, I think that cultures have evolved and strengthened over time as they have had no access to other cultures. And I think filling in the gap, so I'll speak from my own experience as a Black American person, that the erasure of our African experience, you know, be it for whatever ethnic group that we might have come from, that erasure resulted in a gap that also was filled with a variety of other of historical, cultural, language, etc., that created a culture that then, in a way, is a sort of ethnicity. But I'm just going to talk about ethnic identities more specifically, although every now and again I'll talk about racial identity. So I think it's also important to remember that parents, caregivers, role models are key for establishing pride, shared values, traditions, and practices. And when those people are not what they should be to us, then it also can create a crisis that actually might create something beautiful. And I think we often talk about it in a deficit frame, like, oh, people weren't there for us, or, oh, our cultures abandon us, which we often see, for example, with, if you're a sexual minority or gender minority, your cultural group that you might have been proud of might reject you. And that is going to have its own sense of hurt and pain, but it also may lead to that gap that creates a rich culture that then people who are identifying with those different cultures also have an opportunity to take hold of and be a part of. And it may be that's how their identity moves, that particular identity, sort of as a Black queer person or as a Black trans person, that may take a precedence, because that is the culture, the Black queer culture, above just Black or above just whatever your ethnic group is, into the ways in which Black queer is its own culture. Or there are many Black queer cultures, but you might identify with one of them. And then adolescence may be the first time we reflect on the implications of group identification. And so that's another reason why adolescence is so tough. We think about adolescence as, you know, a lot of psychological manifestations happen during adolescence. But part of the reason is that we realize that the world is not great, right? So we're in a state where we actually are fooling ourselves for a lot of our childhood, which I think that's fine. I think we should protect children from the world for as long as possible. But then you become an adolescent, and then you realize that, wow, there's a lot that goes into how I see myself. And the way in which individuals start understanding those implications help them to make decisions in their lives. And that's going to change, like I said in the beginning, these identity processes are going to sometimes contradict themselves. They're going to be changing. And all of that is going to happen. And this is regardless of how close, quote unquote, or far from their ethnic identity or practices that they are. And so I want to think about this idea of crisis and commitment. I use these two photos to sort of think about two concepts. And one is sort of the idea that Blackness, there's a problem with Blackness, or a problem with being of a Black ethnic group. And also the opposite, which is that you're Black, but you're coconut, right? Like you are in black in skin only, or you know, ethnically removed, sort of Black, or your ethnic group in name only. And so you know, that type of self-reflection may be the crisis that you need to really start giving language to who you are. I just want to touch a little bit on stress and how stress plays a role in this process. So remember, we can't just, with Black people, you know, I think Black people in much of Africa and the diaspora, we can't talk about a stress-free existence or a oppression-free existence, right? And so we always have to think about all of this within the frame of the external experiences. And so one thing to think about is that that when children are collapsed, right, they're pushed in to consistently yield to others, their identity might suffer, their identity development might suffer, and they may, you know, have the question of who am I, because all I've ever known is yielding to others. And so that's one kind of gentle end of the spectrum. But then we get to other types of extreme experiences and how they play a role on us as we develop. And we know that because of systemic oppression, racism and other types of oppression, that young people who are Black are more likely to go through especially these adverse community experiences, discrimination, poverty, poor housing, violence. All of these things are related to the structural, like they're designed that way. They're designed for Black people to be more likely to be in these environments. And because of those things, we're often raised by people who might also be going through some of these things that result in these other adverse childhood experiences. And so then what happens when you might have gone through those things is those things are going to be informing how your brain develops. And the good thing about these frames is that we know that it doesn't mean that you're brain damaged. And in fact, it often results in people who are more loving, more protective, more thoughtful. And in that scenario, we just have to be mindful of that process, and that we can heal people out of it as long as we don't continue to hurt or oppress them. As long as we give people space to heal and be full, we can actually support them out of any of the negative sides of that. But we can also promote the positive sides, which is that you know, people who've been through it can often be thoughtful, protective, and loving in ways that others aren't. And then I also want to think about this idea from this what is her name? Akila, can't remember her last name, but that's her picture there. This scholar on Black identity development, she kind of asks us the question of what do these marginalized experiences contribute to our identity, and how is it something that's actually an understandable, potentially natural effect of going through all of this. And this is where I think, as you think about young people going through the process of identity, we have to think about how some things that we might consider maladjusted or poor coping are actually, they make a lot of sense for where these folks are developmentally and within the context of the wider world. And so I just want to share this quote from her, which is that choosing to join a gang may both give the young person a sense of identity and provide him or her with the means of protection, right? So like the fact that that's needed at all is a part of the larger world. We might see that as maladaptive to extreme life stressors, or somebody in the same situation might join a pro-social community-based organization, and that might be considered more adaptive. And in that engagement, we get the opportunity for young people get the opportunity to constructively address issues of injustice. And if we go back to that model that I showed you about sort of our moral progression, we can see how you know, each of these might fit into any step on that process, or as they evolve, they may find that you know, the pros and cons, they differ over time. But we can see that it actually makes sense that some of this stuff happens, and it happens within our communities, and we might be affected by it, but it actually makes sense to our developmental, to us developing through these very harsh realities. And so I just want to shift a little bit and start specifically talking about what we're talking about here when it comes to racial and ethnic identity. And what do you guys think? Like, what would you say is like your definition of racial identity or ethnic identity in your own words or thoughts?
Okay, we have a hand. Tulani, feel free to jump.
Okay, as a first-year anthropology tutor, we usually define race or racial categorization as a social construct, but nothing that is intrinsically biological. That's that's the standard definition for first-year students.
So what do you think? Do you think that serves?
Since the session is recorded, I don't want to throw in politically charged statements. I am a tutor, so I rather reserve my definition of what I think race is.
Okay, you have said it all. Okay, I hear you. Any other thoughts? Now you go ahead.
Okay, Matome, feel free to go ahead.
Okay. I think I wanted to also maybe in terms of ethnic identity, my own sort of personal belief is that ethnic identity is the way it's structured now doesn't really capture our identity, because it kind of forces us to have, I guess, categories, to categorize ourselves. And this, I'm speaking about myself as well, where now my ethnic identity isn't actually recognized as part of an identity, because it is like a dialect type of ethnic identity in a sense. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't actually fit into one ethnic group. So my ethnicity can be traced along 3 different types of groups. So I think from my perspective, we shouldn't be having these ethnic typologies, you know? We shouldn't be trying to have an actual, I guess, classified ethnic identity, but rather have a fluid type of any sort of family, or any one person can decide that because I have these ethnic roots in my family, I would choose to identify as a, I don't know, an omni-ethnic person, if that were to ever exist.
Yeah. So that's great. it's a little bit the punchline, but I think that that's part of the reason that we have this discussion is that you know, when you talk about identity, there's tons of identities, right? We can have a 2-hour lecture on gender identity, and we can have another 2-hour lecture on sexual orientation as it relates to your physicality. We could have another, you know, 2-hour lecture on each of those things. And, you know, I had to like pare it down to just focusing on one thing. And I think that one of the central ideas about identity is that it's identities, right? So that we have many, and that there are sort of many sub categories, but that there's also that it's also all a process. And part of the reason that it doesn't serve is when there's contradictions to us playing roles. So like if somebody in the US has one Black grandparent 2 generations back, they might be considered Black or they might not. It depends on who they're around, what the context is, who's policing Blackness at that particular moment, and things like that. And so it may be that you know, some people are okay with a multiplicity of identities and some people are not. And how do we navigate all of these different spaces where we thought we were okay with having a certain sense of self, and then you move to another environment and that whole thing just completely gets shattered. And so I think that the point is that none of this is particularly solid. And you know, the idea of race as a social construct, I think race is a social construct. I also think that race is more than just the DNA differences. And I think taking all the DNA away, taking away race from everything just because of the DNA similarities between different racial groups, I think also misses some important stuff. So all that to say that there's nothing supreme about any of this these definitions, but they just give us food for thought. So one of the ways to think about ethnic identities are around cultural values, beliefs, bonds, and sense of kinship, right? So, you know, what's interesting is, you know, Rachel Dolezal, right? Like I always think about her as like this strangely fitting person. But, you know, if you think about bond, right? Like, you know, that I guess she meets that, she feels like she has a bond. Maybe she feels like her beliefs are a particular way or cultural values, but then how much of this is about stereotype and being a certain way because you believe that certain people are a certain way? And how is that different from anyone else, right? And so when we think about ethnic and racial identities, particularly ethnic identities, it's usually kind of tied up into these elements. But again, there's nothing supreme about this particular notion of ethnic identity, but rather it's something to think about, something to hang things on, hang thought processes on. However, when we do define it this way, it is shown that a strong ethnic identity contributes to a high sense of self-esteem. And those people who make that role, the folks that are giving you the identity are going to be people who are going to support that sense of self. So I want to know, aside from what we just heard, what gets in the way of having a strong ethnic identity for you? So what gets in the way of having a strong identity for you? So we just heard sort of about how the multiplicity or the multitude of ethnic identities results in a sense of feeling like one doesn't belong to any one in particular, and in a way it's like a new ethnic identity. So for you, can anyone think of anything that gets in the way of them having a strong ethnic identity?
All right, Tulani, go ahead.
Well, personally, I think being existentially alive, like it's an obstacle to be self-assertive. So when one is ostracized for being assertive, and I think that's an obstacle in having a strong sense of ethnic identity. So existential death is the norm. So if you become existentially alive, you become almost the enemy of your same ethnic group. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, and it's an example of
Dr.
the ways in which it's rejected. Hello?
There's another hand. Pilani, please go ahead.
Go ahead. Are you muted?
Pilani, I think you might be muted. Pilani? Okay, I think you can respond to Tulani so long, and I'll try to message Pilani privately.
Okay. So the idea of existential death, right? So it's actually just a specific example of a broader issue that comes up, which is this idea that that if we don't fit with the classic definitions, it can feel as if we don't belong because there's an invisible gatekeeper, right? Like, so somebody's at the gate of your identity and they have a checklist, and the checklist, it determines whether you're allowed in or not. And that is something that, you know, we'll talk about when we get to the stages, but you know, it's something to think about, right? Like, who is at the gate? Who gives them the authority to be at the gate? Why is there a gate in the first place, right? So that's a prime example of one of the major thought processes, which is, you know, what access do I have to an identity if I don't fit it completely, based on whatever, which we'll talk
Fantastic.
about.
I think Pilani is unmuted now.
All right, go ahead.
Briefly. Pilani?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay.
Beautifully.
I was going to say, for me, I think my education has somehow become I'd say a barrier. And I can see how, because ethnic identity, I think, is more ascribed to you, and you begin to sort of also find your space and negotiate where you fit in. But then when people start seeing you somehow differently or somewhat often outsider, even though you consider yourself such an insider, and it is because of this thing that we all somehow feel will lead to some form of emancipation, but it also indirectly then alienates you from that part of you which you feel resonates with that group of your, I guess, choosing. And so it's like this weird space where you, I don't know how to describe it, where it's almost like you don't have a choice.
Yep. 100%. No, that's actually beautiful, and remember I said the whole thing is a drama, right? And often there's multiple voices, and they may even be speaking in different ways, like opposite ways. And I think that what you're getting at, again, the specific of education is just one way in which now whoever the gatekeepers are might say, now I think of you differently. And so the external effect, and the literature around sort of Black people's and identity really talks a lot about the external, and it's something that really we have to think about, which is who owns identity, and how can they rock the base of your identity, or how are they doing it when young people are developing, especially given that a strong sense of identity is associated with overall well-being, right? So, and this is again another reason why I think ethnic and racial identity can sometimes be trumped by other identities where people feel more at home. And so the question really is, like, do you want access to different identities? And if so, how do you take it when there's that gatekeeper, the imaginary gatekeeper there?
Sure. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Just a quick comment on the chat by Matome, who says that heritage is a strong aspect of forging an ethnic identity. Our history in terms of our ethnicities has been distorted by colonialism. Knowledge of this fact leads to my questioning of cultural norms and how, and how they reinforce colonial thinking.
Beautiful. Love that. Hold that thought. So I'm going to quickly go through these stages of identity, but like, you guys are wonderful scholars, and or just that the fact that came up now is just beautiful to me. Okay, so let's talk about one of the sort of theories that comes into play around identity. And this is not like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. You can go back and forth between these different stages. And again, they're only useful in that they might help you to understand what you yourself are going through, what somebody else is going through. I think now in the social media age, where anyone can attack you for anything, I do think it's important that we at least have somewhat of a frame for where people are and why people might be there. And so there's this idea that identity happens over time. Your firm sense of identity happens over time, and that certain things have to happen in order for us to get to a committed sense of identity or identity achievement. And really, this model, again, it's not the only model, and it's not the only thing that there is, but it's just a way of thinking about hanging different ideas. And that is that a person's meaningful exploration versus a person's commitment. And so if you've had a meaningful exploration and you've made a commitment, then you're more likely to have a firm sense of identity. And that firm sense of identity is what's associated with overall well-being. And I think, like, as Black people, we have a right to well-being just like anybody else. So just to talk about the different groups. So one, an unexamined ethnic identity is the I haven't thought about it, I haven't committed to anything. And this might be the lack of exploration. We talked about in the beginning, when you're young, you might not think of it at all. And in the US, underrepresented minority people like myself, minoritized people might accept the values and attitudes of the majority culture. I know I definitely went through this when I was a child, and by adolescence began to question it. But if somebody would have spoken to me at a certain age, they'd have been like, oh, that poor child. And then includes internalized negative reviews of our own group held by the majority. So like I talked about, there's a point where you internalize based on implicit and explicit experiences some of the negative views. And it's not just related to racism, but it's also just, it's all really related to some version of racism. But cultural racism, I don't think we talk about enough. but it's really cultural supremacy is really one of the ways in which we get sort of bombarded gently, and it's tied into capitalism and commercialism and the way commercialism involves inadequacy, and how we're just bombarded with these images, and so some internalization happens before we even have language. So then identity diffuse is not committed or engaged in exploration, may have some kind of thoughts or deep assessments, but in the end, it's nothing is sticking in terms of sense of self. So you might have a moment where you realize things aren't right, or where you might move along and say, this is, I feel good about being affiliated with this particular identity, but it's going to be sort of not yet committed. I see actually lots of young people in this stage. And then moratorium is sort of often thought of as the stage before you get to something solid, and that is going to go until you reach a crisis. So as we talked about in the beginning, crisis of towards commitment. And so you might be exploring roles, exploring values, moving between conformity and rebellion. And then at this time, you're sort of anxious because you want to be a certain way, but you might have some instability with the way that way fits with other parts of who you are. And so this is sort of an active process, but it's an exploratory process. And then there's foreclosure, which is when you're committed to something without exploration. So this you see this also a lot in young people and in older people. Some people never go through an identity like a real identity exploration, and you see them. I mean, I feel like they're all over America. This idea that there's this exploration or this non-exploration. So I am fully committed to being a white supremacist, and I don't want to think twice about it, right? Like I feel like that's just like America's like full of people like that, and so it helps to ease anxiety and do all kinds of other things to help folks feel like they have a sense of who they are. And it's a very conformative identity, a not very flexible identity, and it's very easily manipulated and managed and led. And then identity achievement is sort of the way it's operationalized is that this is sort of the ideal process, and that stressful situations can occur and you still feel strong in your sense of self. It's thoughtful, it's introspective, it's resolved some of the big questions, especially about the gatekeepers and why the gate's there in the first place. And then moral dilemmas when they come up often are more associated with those higher level, the universal moral reasonings. And there's the confidence and acceptance and internalization of one's ethnicity. So it understands the contradictions of life and external motivations, but it also is still firm in acceptance of oneself. There's also the element in the literature around racial identity formation that there's this notion of salience, ideology, centrality, and regard. And so when especially people who are minoritized in the world, either whether they're actually the numerical minority or they're just minoritized, salience is about how the meaning, so how important is it to being Black in a variety of situations. Centrality is about the extent to which people define themselves under racial or ethnic terms. So it may be more plural for you or more central for you. Regard is the positive or negative feelings, and this is heavily associated. Positive regard for your racial or ethnic group is actually very strongly associated with academic performance, and ideology is about attitudes and opinions about how you should behave or how others should behave. And so these contexts also come into play when you're, Black and you're minoritized, and you're also thinking about this, again, because of the external factors. And so that's what I want us to start thinking about, is the external factors. Why are there so many external factors pushing on Black identities, right? Like, why is so much related to how we are seen or how we are thought we're supposed to react, and why is why are identities so tied to why do we have to think about salience and centrality, particularly as Black people, in a way that others don't, and it's often because of these external factors that force us into a space where we must think about these things. As in Botswana, I have a friend who said she was never Black until she went to the US. She was Kalanga, she was Motswana. And so, there's something to be said about living in spaces where Blackness is sort of defined externally, and so now you have to sort of have this whole framework around it. And I just want to briefly talk about Margaret Beale Spencer, who is a identity psychologist who's done really great work around Black identities. And this is just a complex model, but essentially it talks about how those external factors and how external factors, we can't get rid of them as Black people. We're always sort of being pushed on between our own cultural values and the ways in which we're discriminated against, and all of that stuff, and all the things I talked about, the physical changes and all of that contributes to all these external ideas about us, and how that then relates to our relationships with stress and our coping mechanisms. And one of the things that these stressors do, according to Margaret Beale Spencer's model, is they tell us as adolescents, like, oh, I've had all these stressful experiences, and how I respond to them may make me who I am. And again, that's part of the question that was just asked, which is externally, right? Because colonialism, racism, all of these things have been so much a part of,
Dr. Brooks. Okay, please give her about 10 seconds. I see she's reconnecting. Okay, she's still reconnecting. All right. Okay, she connected and then disconnected. Please give me 20 seconds to try reconnect her. Okay, Dr. Brooks is joining. She should be.
What was
Hi.
that?
Back.
Hi.
You got disconnected for a bit, but we see.
No wonder. I was like, oh, nobody's saying anything. Let me say something.
Okay.
Did somebody have an answer, or should I finish?
We actually didn't get to this part. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Oh, okay.
So this is the last time we heard you.
Oh, okay. So this was next. So you heard this quote and what I was saying about it.
Can you just repeat it? I don't think we
Okay.
did it.
So Margaret Beale Spencer made this model, and the model is basically showing all these external, each of these things is somewhat related to external elements. And the point I was making here is that there's a lot of external things that go into Blackness, experiences of oppression, ideas about who Black people are supposed to be, stereotypes about who Black people are supposed to be, and how we are supposed to act both from the cues given to us by our own family members and ethnic community and all of that. And all of that external stuff, but particularly the external stuff that revolves around oppression and colonialism, and the ways in which dominant people who are dominant, right, because they're like violently dominant, can oppress us. We end up reacting to those things, and we spend a lot of time reacting to these various stressors, and these stressors may lead adolescents and young adults to think this is who I am all the time, meaning our sense of self can be tied to our reactions to these acts of dominance and these acts of oppression and these views of us, our physical selves, our emotional selves. There's a dominant opinion about all of those things, and we spend a lot of time reacting, and it can get to the point where that reacting ends up telling us this is who I am all the time. And so part of what the last question was, which I think is really profound, is who am I without all of those external things that I'm constantly having to respond to. And this it escalates, you know, if you're a Black trans woman, you're constantly reacting, necessarily reacting. And so who am I if I'm not like a colonized, oppressed person, right? Like, who am I? And I think that is a primary part of this whole process, and what we have to think about as Black people and as Black peoples in the world coming into ourselves. And so the question is, how do stereotypes tie into your sense of self? And how do you see stereotypes affect the collective identities that you relate to? So each of the different identities, how do you feel like stereotypes affect those?
Sure. Dr. Brooks, can I please ask we park the question because we don't have a lot of time left,
Oh, okay.
So that we can have a discussion at the end, so that you have an opportunity to finish your presentation.
Okay, so I'll just finish, and then we'll talk about each of these things as people reflect on them. So I'm going to bring up a few thoughts that have come up in some of the discourse around identity, particularly related to like Black folks and different African identities. So this is really centered around this idea that the inconsistent content in self-concept, that recognition is a common source of distress. And again, if we're having all kinds of external affiliations with our sense of self, what does it mean when we're distressed? But the distress, and I argue that the whole reason that this kind of conversation is important to have over and over again is that it could actually give us something that is valuable. So I'll just give you this food for thought. How do these principles apply to the collective groups? Like, so given that we're all sort of responding to internalized racism, external racism, different types of white supremacy, colonialism, and we've been responding to these things for so long, how do we collectively think about our sense of of identity, and where do you think we are collectively, whoever we is to you, in this identity process, and then how do we think about our collective step where we are in this collective process. And so, you know, I think it's really important as we think about stereotypes and oppression and how they hit us, that when these discriminatory acts and acts of marginalization occur, we could go in one of two directions. And I think the direction of pride is really where the liberation is, and why I think young people are really poised to collectively bring us out, at least, you know, in my culture and community. I think young people do play a huge role as they reject oppression towards pride and force us to think about how we may be internalizing shame. I think that it's important to think about the fact that most countries in Africa have gone through lightning speed changes, and there are very few other groups in the world that have gone through as much historical, geopolitical, social, cultural change as quickly as most African cultures. And that, I think, is really, really important to the process and thought process of identity formation, is that a lot of these places that think that they're advanced or consider themselves supreme or whatever, they went through hundreds of years of like no advancement in order to get to where they are today. And the amount of clashing changes that have occurred on the context of Africa, the changes that colonialism particularly forced to happen with when places were sort of left with underdevelopment, all of those things.
Okay, I see Dr. Brooks is reconnecting again, so I'll give her a few seconds to come up again.
So I.E. Arma wrote in 2006 essentially that there are sort of debates over identity, and that one of the roots of the current structural and identity problems in Africa is that the continent entered to a highly active phase of political agitations with very little time for cultural workers to do the necessary preparatory work. So a lot of the context is sort of designed by in a political frame. And so Arma argues that that the people who are culture makers are not politicians usually, and that we haven't given culture makers space sort of in our collective consciousness to do the work of reconciling whatever version of our lives that we want them to reconcile. So that's one thought. Another thought by Césaire is that we must be lucid, select what we need, and follow our own road, to seek a particular African oath, at the same time taking advantage of the contributions of the other worlds, but well knowing, fully realizing that in reality, nobody has thought for us or can think for us. And so essentially the idea that that there's something to offer, but we need to retake our thought processes, which I think is an interesting idea. And then Jean-Marie Makang, who speaks about this writer Temples, who wrote about Bantu culture. Jean-Marie Makang says that Temples' characterization of tradition asserts itself as nostalgia for the past or for the lost paradise, and is an avoidance of the present. And he's actually rejecting Temple's characterization because he says that it basically makes a mockery out of tradition, and it also makes tradition something sort of like an ancient relic that is not dynamic and alive. And the point of this, the undertone of this content is that of course tradition is alive and it is not static, but who defines what tradition is? One of the things that comes up in this writing actually is about chieftaincies in Ghana, and how chieftaincies were actually established by colonial powers. And actually before that, it was a very different political structure, but it sort of was externally defined as this traditional thing for the manipulation of the colonial powers. This Algerian Albert Memmi says, in response to the idea of the effect of colonialism on cultural and tradition, says the culture of the dominated group is affected, and its tradition becomes malleable.
Let's just wait for Dr. Brooks to reconnect again. And she's reconnecting. Okay, I think there's a problem with her network. Let's give it a few more seconds and see if she's going to be able to come back. Hi, KG.
Hi. I quite like Matume's sort of like, reckoning with how he doesn't necessarily fit into one particular identity. And I think a big part of it was how, we sort of like, operationalize these terms, right? So most of the time, social scientists use these terms as categories of practice, right? For us to make sense of the world. And I thought it was interesting when she even said that, and I think it's a bit unfair because I wanted to pose this question to her, how she said she was going to use race and ethnicity interchangeably, right? Where, for example, in South Africa, we have race as in like racial groups, and we have ethnicities which are very colonial, sort of like, understanding of the different groups in South Africa, right? So even how she uses that as a category of practice, I feel like it can cause a lot of confusion, especially seeing that, she is really looking at, young black girls in Botswana. So I thought that was interesting. So I like Matume's reckoning with that. I don't fit into one thing because I'm this, I'm this. I'm like, yeah, for most of us, I think that's the case. Yeah, but I think it's coming back now, so we will have a.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. There's no sign of reconnecting, so I think if
I see one person joining.
Yes, so but that's not her. That's Bosley.
Oh, that's not her. Oh, wow, this is unfortunate because I think her thing has, it's a lot to sort of like, you know, to have a conversation around, actually,
Absolutely. I think so
especially
too.
from a medical doctor. So I find it quite interesting how she's thinking about, you know, all of
Yeah,
this, you know, yeah,
fantastic.
especially,
Yeah.
yeah, you wanted to say something?
No, sorry. I'm sorry to cut you. You can finish your thought.
Yeah, no, I was just like, as anthropologists, obviously, and as anthropology becomes more evolved in inverted
Yeah.
commas, and it
Yes.
changes and becomes more interdisciplinary, you know, very progressive. I think, you know, it's always interesting to hear how the biological sciences, you know,
Yes.
or the other sciences think about issues of identity and such. But yeah,
Yes.
she's back. Yay.
She's back. Dr.
I
Brooks,
didn't realize I was out.
you were. Did you hear everything?
No, I just got back like 2 seconds ago.
Oh, okay.
Where did
KG,
you guys end?
can you show us your screen? What you have?
Yeah. So sorry, guys.
No worries, no worries.
It was a slide after Makam, I think.
Okay, let me. Oh, you need to make me a moderator again, I think.
Oh, okay. That I can easily do. Okay, you should be one.
Yep. Makang. Okay. So you heard Makang, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So let me just quickly go through these last few thoughts. So Albert Memmi, who is Algerian, said in response to the effect of colonialism and culture on tradition, that the culture of the dominant group is affected and its tradition is maladjusted. Okay, so he's saying that colonialism has fundamentally changed our cultures and our traditions. Bawa and Ndiaye Ogunyankin said that Africa rising discourses, so ideas of African positivism, simultaneously challenge and interrupt problematic colonial constructions of Africa as backward and in need of salvation. So it's good that we're challenging these things, but we also sometimes often recenter the West as the progenitor of progress, therefore reiterating the colonial tale. And I would argue that that reiteration is beyond just the progress, but rather also because we spend so much time responding to the West's vision of us, you know, we're not that, or disidentifying, we don't have as much space or time to tell who we actually are. Baoud Mami, who's also an Algerian, writes that it seems that the African intellectual elite's performance embodies the opinion that there's a long way to go before the picture of the colonized African fades out. And his point is actually that if that picture of the colonized African is going to fade out, it has to be faded out by not continuing to constantly respond to this, recreate this vision by bringing attention to it. And that the challenge lies in whether or not African elite members are convinced to address deeper questions, probably about what to read and learn, in ways in which modernity can serve to further this pursuit of learning about Africanness. And then a lucid treatment of the question could break the manacles and factually achieve decolonization of the mind. And then multiculturalism is something that I think is important to think about, because multiculturalism, I think, which is normally associated with immigrants, I think is an important thing to consider as a way to have it all. And, you know, in some of our examples, we talked about multiculturalism, or we talked about the ways in which we identify in some ways, but not other ways. And multiculturalism allows us to not have to choose one or the other, but to be all that we are. And so my last slide is about this notion of that the Steve Biko quote. But the end of the Steve Biko quote is the first step, therefore, is to make the Black man come to himself, to pump life back into his empty shell. And then he says to infuse him pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth. And I think that this quote is, I ended with this quote because I really want you guys to think about the ways in which we sort of are constantly responding, and how identity formation for both our young people and us as we're guiding them is so much based on reacting to oppression and to all these other things, that we don't get to own as much of it as other people might. So I'll end there.
Fantastic. Can everyone unmute themselves and clap for Dr. Brooks?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. So we are actually out of time, and we've lost already a number of people because there's tens of comments on the comment section from people who had to leave a bit early. So just there was such a rich discussion whilst you disconnected that we were having amongst ourselves. So I'm just going to give Kagiso as well as Batome a final chance if they want to just add some comments. And then you can just close us off, Dr. Brooks. But I think consensus is that you must come back, preferably when it's safer for us together. I think this would be so rich, particularly in person, but we've already gotten so much. So Kagiso, over to you, and then Matome, if you have some final thoughts, and then Dr. Brooks, close us out.
Yeah, I think mine was a very broad comment on the decision to sort of like use I think it was ethnicity and race, right, interchangeably, right? And Matome says something about how he was reckoning with the fact that, he didn't fit a particular sort of like identity. And it makes so much sense to me, especially in thinking about, this kind of terms as categories of practice, right? So by categories of practice, I mean how we sort of like use this term to understand social life, right? And they're usually used by scientists, social scientists, etc. So I think it's a very important thing to consider, when you sort of like, look at these things, because, for example, and in the United States, mind you, might be a very different thing, right? Issue, but in South Africa, race and ethnicity are not interchangeable, right?
Right.
So, yeah, for example, I'm black racially, but my ethnicity is I'm a Botswana. You get, and within even that, they can go even deeper in terms of how there's not necessarily homogeneity in terms of how we think about these things. So I think it's something that's very important to consider. I don't know, especially looking at even black girls from Botswana. I think that's what you are looking at and all that, right? So I thought that was very interesting how you said you're going to use that. And for me, I think, there's sort of like a cautionary tale that we need to take into consideration when we sort of like, use these categories of practice. But thank you so much. This was a lot to think about, and I think we'll think about it a lot more going forward. Thank you so much, Dr. Brooks.
Thanks.
Sure. Matome?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brooks, for the presentation. It was very interesting. There was quite a lot to actually engage and try and break down. And I just wanted to maybe just throw in just two things that I was thinking about towards the end of the discussion, which the first of which for me, from a psychological perspective, I guess, was the cognitive dissonance that comes from these identities. Because when you ask the question of now, who are we outside of being oppressed, outside of all of those things, I thought about how as South Africans, because of the extreme inequalities and the extreme poverty and whatnot, I don't know if we can actually really answer that question, because a lot of the time you are now having to perform different identities to access different kind of spaces. For instance, my cultural beliefs and whatnot are kind of shunned upon in the corporate sector. So now if I spend most of my time in the corporate sector, now when I get to work, I need to be a completely different person. And then when I get home, now I need to be a completely different person. So I just wanted to also, I guess, maybe how that could affect a person's in terms of how they deal with the stress of it all, or how they deal with actually having a concrete idea of who they are as a person, or does it lead to some sort of like nonchalant, performative type of existence where you just, you know, you fit into whatever identity you need to fit into, just so you can access the basic needs that you need to access before you can even start thinking about, does this thing actually make me happy? Is this actually who I am? The first thing you need to think about is, what identity gives me access to this space? And that might not necessarily be who you are. But yeah, thank you very much. It's quite a lot to think about.
Thank you. Thank you both for both of those comments. So I definitely think that race and ethnicity are not interchangeable. I do think some of the principles are relevant to both, though. One is that racial identity and ethnic identity are both colonized and oppressed identities. And so I think some of the context we have here is something to think about, and also the ways in which our ethnic identities, the culture, we talk, in the US we talk a lot about the culture, right? But each of us have our own version of the culture, and how does the culture push and pull at our senses of selves. And so that's the only reason I use them interchangeably, not to disrespect one or the other and presume that they're the same. And then the notion of spaces in different spaces. I think multiculturalism, if you have it, meaning you own each of your different cultures equally without any conflict or ambivalence, I think that offers something to modern folks. But what I think that modern being like people alive in 2021, like literally everyone. But I think the question is, are you multicultural and that you have respect for each of your cultures equally and feel like you're a part of each of them equally, or are you privileging one over the other? And are you one, and or are you only going into the space a particular way because that's what you have to do, versus actually feeling like you're a part of that culture? Do you feel like you belong in that space, or do you feel like you're pretending? And I think that's where the psychological negative effects come in, is if you're faking and you're putting on a show because you believe that fundamentally who you are is inadequate or less than, and you're going into the space completely fake, that's when it causes a lot of negative psychological effects. But if you actually find yourself safe in both spaces and you've become you have a multicultural mindset, then it can actually be empowering. So yeah, so thank you guys for your comments. I agree, we need to be in person where there's no technical difficulties. And I hope that you got a lot to think about, and I look forward to your thoughts. If you guys wanna Google or Twitter me and take me to task, feel free. To continue the conversation. I really enjoyed you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I was telling Dr. Brooks earlier that the 25th is a very tricky day in South Africa because it's payday. Thank you for everyone on their payday, I'm assuming, for making time out 2 hours of their time. So I think everyone now can go and enjoy their Puza Thursday. So thank you so much. We look forward to hosting you again soon, Dr. Brooks.
Please. Thanks.